Earlier this week, the reproductive rights group Family Planning Advocates released an ad, a television ad, supporting the governor's women's equality agenda. Abortion rights are expected to be included in that agenda, but no legislation has been introduced yet. The group has been pushing for this change for several years now with no success. And even though a Siena poll in March showed that 80% of New Yorkers do support legislation that would codify the U.S. Supreme Court decision under Roe v. Wade that gives women the right to have abortions, there is a big stumbling block. It is the state Senate. Joining me now to talk more about this legislation, we have Tracey Brooks, President and CEO of Family Planning Advocates, and also Andrea Miller, President of NARAL Pro-Choice New York. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Okay.
Liz, real quickly, just to let you know, the Women's
do.
Equality Coalition, a coalition of over 20 organizations that make up the steering committee.
So it's everybody.
It's everybody.
We
it's
all
us,
put out
both
the
of
ad.
us.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right. So, well, let's talk about the ad, though.
Great.
First of all, how it's a radio ad.
No,
there's a
TV
television ad.
Right, because I
actually.
just saw it. It's
Yes.
Men speaking as if they were women.
Right.
It's very interesting. We'll talk about that too. But the radio ad targets Dean Skelos.
And
That's the NARAL ad.
That's
yes.
the NARAL ad.
Yes.
You guys are all right. So we'll start
Sure.
with you.
Well, actually, it's important to put this in context, right?
Okay.
Which is the Women's Equality Coalition came out this week, and we're very excited about it and very much part of that, on the full 10-point agenda, the governor's women's equality agenda.
Right.
And of course, that includes a woman's right to choose, but it also includes a whole host of other critical issues to advancing women's full participation. So it's pay equity, it's pregnancy discrimination, it's sexual harassment in the workplace. It's a whole host of really critical issues in the workplace, in home, in housing and lending, all of those issues, as well as the right to choose. It's really important, we thought, at this stage in the game, 6 weeks out from the end of the session, to really place out on the agenda a strong, powerful ad that begs the question, how on earth could we today in New York State have women be held back in such a way? And what is the solution? And that solution is the women's equality agenda that the governor has proposed. Now, simultaneously, as you so well know, Liz, because he's done it on your show, the biggest stumbling block in all of this, sadly, is the Senate leadership, and particularly Dean Skelos.
Yep.
And NARAL Pro-Choice New York felt it was really important to make sure that he was called out for, frankly, essentially stomping his feet and saying, no, 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 I'm never letting this come to the floor. I'm going to stand in the way of women's participation in our society, and I'm going to say no because I just can. And we wanted to call him out on that and say, listen, you need to understand that your positions, your policy positions, this isn't about him as a person, it's him as a politician, are completely out of step. They're out of step with what the Senate chamber wants. They're out of step with what New Yorkers want.
Okay.
We thought it was important to make that clear.
So you guys believe the votes are there?
Yes.
You believe the votes are there?
Absolutely.
Yes. How many votes are there?
Well, we have 63 today, people sitting in the chamber, and we need 32.
Right.
So we will to start with, we're looking at a comprehensive package of issues, 10 issues that will go together, and they will all come together. We will be moving it as one bill. And what you'll see there is we'll have great support bipartisanly because the members of the legislature recognize that New Yorkers are asking to have this bill passed. It's very different than the other bills that we've seen moved together that were done, but that were brought together by the leadership of the governor in consultation with community leaders and legislators. We're working very hard to move it. There's bipartisan support, and it will be vastly and broadly supported because the people of New York are saying they want it passed.
Okay, but you think that there are, you're counting heads. I know you're counting heads. Do you know that there are sufficient votes to pass it? Because you're -2 Democrats, as far as I know, at any rate. Can you make that up in the GOP conference?
We'll be able to make it up in the GOP conference because this is a package, a comprehensive package that will make New York a great place for women and families. This is a package that all legislators can get behind because the issues are so critical and important to New Yorkers.
Okay, what's it going to say?
What's the bill going to say? It's going to be exactly what the governor laid out. It's going to be making sure that sexual harassment in the workplace is zero tolerance. It's going to make sure that a woman's right to choose is explicitly protected in accordance with Roe versus Wade. Yes.
What's that specifically going to say? Because that seems to be...
It's a fair question. Yeah. Look, Liz, you know, because we've had this conversation before, it's been 7 years that we've been trying to move a bill called the Reproductive Health Act. It was a very comprehensive bill. It was much more extensive. And what we have made clear through this process is, working with the governor, working with our allies, working together, is that we need to have something so crystal clear that nobody can mischaracterize. We have had such extraordinary mischaracterization, not only of the Reproductive Health Act, but even of the governor putting out the idea of making sure that our laws are up to date and aligned with Roe versus Wade. There's been these wild accusations, these wild claims that this is some crazy radical expansion. We want to make crystal clear when this language comes out that everyone can look at it and say, you know what, I get it.
All right,
Women's right to choose, it's simple, it's straightforward, I'm in, let's get this passed.
But the other piece about why it needs to happen is 40 years ago, the decision of Roe versus Wade required New York State to do this. So what we're doing is codifying Roe as we were required to do 40 years ago.
It has been talked about, and I know you guys have heard this, so it can't come as any surprise.
Absolutely.
That maybe what the Senate could get on board with is something as simple as if for some reason the U.S. Supreme Court undoes Roe, then New York stands firm in its support of the rights under Roe.
Well, look, here's what we think can happen here. Is we think it can be very simple. We agree with you there. What you just laid out, and this is sort of an interesting kind of peek into the dialectic that we've been going through and trying to figure out this language, which is if you pin something just to Roe, which is a Supreme Court precedent that is actually more about sort of the scope of what can and can't be done at the state level and not an actual articulation of here is the law, boom, right? And so we start to find that in the law, you need to be clear. Right? Laws can't be sort of, wavering depending on what might happen here or there. We need to be crystal clear.
But when you get into the details is where you start to lose people.
But maybe instead of the wavering of if something should, then New York makes the affirmative statement that New York does affirm Roe. And that's the law in the state of New York.
Okay.
So that's like
really
this word parsing back and forth that we just had at the table is the kind of negotiations that's working now between groups, legislators, the second floor, meaning the governor's staff.
But not Dean Skelos.
Well, look, the bottom line is, let's be clear about Senate leadership, right? There's Dean Skelos.
Yes.
And there's Senator Klein.
Yep.
And the reality is that the IDC made very clear when they were formed that protecting reproductive choice was a priority. Senator Klein himself has introduced a Reproductive Health Act in the past. And this is a real leadership moment for the IDC and for Senator Klein. So yes, it's true that Dean Skelos is digging in his heels and has done that repeatedly, and he says this is never coming to the floor. But he has done that at other things that have made it to the floor.
Like marriage,
for example, that's a very good example. Particularly when it becomes clear that for the good of the Senate and for the good of the legislature and for the good of the state, it needs to come to the floor. And that's going to be about who else is saying very clearly it needs to be the IDC, it needs to be the Democratic Conference, and it needs to be those key members of the Republican Conference who know that their districts are pro-choice and want to be able to vote their consciences.
The other piece is this agenda has been out there since January, so the public is very well aware of it. Not only did the governor announce, but the piece is unlike, in the shroud of darkness that folks have been saying this women's equality agenda is moving. It's not moving in the shroud of darkness. To start with, it was announced very publicly. The governor has traveled to 60 different locations in the state where he has given the presentation about the women's equality agenda to a standing ovation every time.
Because he doesn't pick the audience or anything.
But Liz,
I'm just saying.
Liz, the Women's Equality Coalition has been working statewide to talk about it back in districts. And then you have all of those sponsors of all of the original legislation who are part of crafting the one piece of legislation to ensure that goals and what's important pieces of the legislation are met. So this is a collaborative. People are aware of it. We've been talking about what the goals of the legislation are, and we are writing it. It's not that we're, anyone's moving in the darkness of night. This is, we just sat, the three of us.
Yes, I know, but Dean Skelos is not here. How much are you guys spending, unfortunately, how much are you spending on this campaign? You guys have a radio ad.
We do.
The Alliance has a TV ad.
We are spending what it takes to get the word out. We will ensure that the next 6 weeks, we're going to ensure that people understand and know what's so important about the women's equality agenda. And that's what I was saying to you before. The members of both sides of the aisle, of both houses, are aware that their constituents know that the women's equality agenda has been proposed to move through the legislature this year. And so any of the members who stand in the way of letting this bill be moved to the floor and voted on will be viewed in a way in which they have just rejected the women of the state of New York. It's not about reproductive health care. It's about 10 issues, and not to allow it to come to the floor, not to work on it, and not to say that the women of New York count or that you care about them is certainly not a message that I think even Dean Skelos would stand up for, because I believe he cares about the women of New York State.
Okay. I don't know what to say in the face of that. We will see. What do you have now? 5 weeks?
5 weeks.
5 weeks. That's
All
right.
right. I'm sure you'll be back, both of you, because
We like to come together.
We do.
Keep
We do.
inviting
We
us.
have a good
Andrea
time
and
tag
Tracey,
teaming.
thank you very much.